landfill gas is declining and isn't really going to be much of interest in the future. Most municipal solid waste, food waste and waste wood are being recycled or used in the area, or we have plans in place for processing those. For example, the sewage sludge, there's a new Sewage Works Yorkshire Water implementing, and they hope to very soon be processing all the sewage sludge in their area. So those didn't give much scope for increasing production. Similarly, straw is quite well used already at the power stations, but is in demand for animal bedding. It's in short supply at the moment and very expensive. Pig and cow manure, there's some potential to use some more of that. But poultry litter seems to have the most potential and has the added advantage that you can use it for anaerobic digestion or for combustion, and combustion can be at a small or a large scale, on farm or at a power station. Energy crops, huge potential, but very little being grown at the moment. So I really wanted to know why it was that farmers aren't growing those crops at the moment. Wood fuel, that was very difficult to assess, and I didn't manage to get a proper assessment of the potential there. A lot of the information isn't up to date or isn't available, but we know that there's a market here in the UK, and but we're reliant on imports from overseas or from other parts of the UK, like Scotland. The UK in the past has set targets for woodland planting, which have consistently been missed in recent years. So we're looking for more woodland creation and more woodland management in the UK, but that's not happened. So I'm interested to know why. So first of those three that I think have potential for more use is poultry litter. And so, as I said, you can be used at small or large scale for combustion or in power stations. Now, on poultry farms, they need a lot of heat to keep the chicks warm when they're young. And the heat from one batch of poultry litter can keep the next lot warm. So it's a really good way of recycling the waste material. The waste litter, that's a mixture of bedding, so straw or wood shavings, and that's mixed with feces and uneaten food. And as I said, that's cleaned out at the end of each cycle. So these small chicks start off about 5 days old, and by the time they're 42 days old, they're old enough to go off to supermarkets. So why aren't we using more litter in this country? The main use at the moment is for organic fertiliser. So farmers are very keen to use it. It's cheaper than use it and better for the environment than using chemical fertilisers. And farmers are paying about £6 to £12 a tonne. On farms, if you wanted to burn it yourself, you need one of these big green machines like in the picture here. They're very expensive. That's because they're not like a wood fuel boiler. You can't just change the fuel. You have to burn litter exactly as it comes out of the poultry shed. You're not allowed to pre-treat it or co-fire it, and you have to burn it at 850 degrees C. So you have to have a fluidised bed machine like this here. Farmers already get the renewable heat incentive if they use wood chip in a wood boiler, so there's no real incentive for them to go on and get one of these machines unless they have a really serious problem getting rid of their litter. Power stations are well supplied at the moment, and AD, that's been a very successful area for using litter. It performs very well in AD, but for most AD plants, 15 to 20% litter in the feedstock mix is as much as they want to use. So I know pretty much what I think is going to happen with litter. There might be some increase in the supply as eggs and poultry continues to get more popular, but the increase I think will be modest in the future. So moving on to energy crops. I think the biggest scope here for using energy crops for heat and power. And these are the 4 crops I focused on, looking at annual maize, grass lays, which are fields of grass grown for 1 to 5 years, harvested 2 to 4 times a year, often overlooked as an AD feedstock, I think. Then the traditional perennial energy crops that we've been looking at for a long time, miscanthus and willow, with sort of miscanthus have a 15-year life and willow 22 to 30 years, with annual miscanthus harvesting and every 3 years for willow generally. So what's happening at the moment with these crops in the UK? This graph shows miscanthus in yellow, willow in green and maize in blue. And you can see that maize, although we won't record, these figures are all from DEFRA and they won't record in the figures separately until 2014, but the uptake shot up, whereas miscanthus and willow have been stagnating, a very slight increase in 2019, but nothing on the scale of maize. So why is that? So as I said, I interviewed a lot of farmers in the area, some of whom had grown these crops in the past and some who still grow them. And it's an area that's had a lot of activity and interest in the past. So they've had a good range of experiences. Some of the early problems included problems establishing the crops and harvesting machinery not being suitable or getting bogged down in the wet soil. Some of the farmers were even involved in the Arbor project, which some of you probably know a lot about. Back in the 1990s, there was going to be a new gasification plant and a lot of planting in the Yorkshire area of energy crops, and the project failed as the technology didn't work properly, needed more investment, but the investors pulled out. After that, the farmers were left without anything to do with their energy crops. Drax picked up the contracts for those for a while, but then they cancelled the contracts in 2016, and some farmers were just left with willow on their farms rotting away, which is still there now. There's only one market for willow, which is with the Iggison paper mill up in Cumbria in the northwest of England, and they generate 50 megawatts of electricity and 30 megawatts of heat from their plant, which all comes from locally grown willow. And the Brigg power station in North Lincolnshire, which is the south of the Yorkshire and Humberside region, they combust miscanthus, and there are still long-term contracts available for planting through Terravesta. So there is a role for miscanthus and willow. They're both in low input crops suitable for remote, poor, mixed or flood prone land, and farmers are happy to devote some of their land to these crops, get a fixed price return, and then focus their energy on their better land. So the key barriers to perennial energy crops, as I mentioned, few contracts are available. No farm will ever plant them without a contract in place. The contracts can't compete at the moment with wheat, which is reaching good prices. So if you had good land, you wouldn't be planting energy crops at the moment. In the past, before Brexit, and I'll be explaining a bit about the impact of Brexit shortly, farmers lost some of their subsidies from the Common Agricultural Policy if they grew energy crops. There are high establishment costs and no income for until the first harvest, and farmers are used to having annual income from their crops, so that's a big barrier unless they have the savings in place to live through those years. There were planting subsidies in the past, but those all came to an end and there's nothing in place at the moment. And as I said, uncertainty over Brexit, farmers weren't prepared to make decisions when I spoke to them because they weren't sure when we were going to actually leave the common market, EU, sorry. And there's some entrenched attitudes among farmers. Some of them think that you should only grow food crops and you should manage the land sort of hard, get all you can out of it. And they just don't feel that growing energy crops is compatible with their way of life or their values. And also it's a longer commitment than farmers are used to. They're used to having 1 or 2 crops a year, and they're not happy with that committing to 15, 20 years for one thing to do. So, as I said, some of the farmers had been growing the crops in the past, and the 3 who had and had got rid of them, when I asked them if they'd grow again, and they said they would. Originally there was some reluctance, so no, unless they came up with a different contract. You never say no, and it's all down to price. And so with the right contract and the right price, then these early adopters, they would grow the crop again, which is important to know. Anaerobic digestion crops, they've had a very different experience. Farmers have got a choice of contract. There's 32 farm-fed plants in the area I was looking at. There's options to have annual contracts direct with the AD plant. The farmers are very happy to grow maize and even more happy to grow grass, which is, as I said, often overlooked, but it was a popular energy crop. Maize and grass were both very easy for farmers to add to their rotation. They were similar to traditional farm crops, and they helped to eradicate blackgrass, which is a very persistent weed, which causes a lot of reduction in yield. So the results from the woodland creation and management interviews, these were more with estate owners who have large areas of woodland already, and foresters, sort of rural foresters and city foresters, a few of those, as well as farmers. And the initial costs for the cost of the trees, the guards, the pest control, protecting trees from pests, that was all very expensive. And the farmers lost their annual farm income for many years once they've planted trees on a site. Pest damage is something that is very serious for farmers. They can lose the value of a timber crop if there's an infestation of grey squirrels, or if there's damage from deer or voles or rabbits, all sorts of things, a big problem. There's a divide here between farming and forestry, a very big cultural divide. Farmers don't consider forestry as something they would want to do on their land, and farmers don't, when they're educated at college or university, they don't learn about forestry. Similarly, foresters don't learn anything about farming. So there's 2 completely different areas or sectors, and we definitely need to break down the barriers between those 2. A lot of land is not suitable for planting trees, although people are always calling for more trees. It's not as simple as it sounds. You can't plant on peat because of the carbon emissions. If you're on a site of special scientific interest, you might not be given permission to plant. Similarly, with an area of outstanding natural beauty, a protected landscape, you won't be able to plant. And also, if a farmer hopes to get planning permission to build houses or something else on their land, then they won't want to plant trees on there. Because once you plant trees, you're very unlikely to be able to change that land use back to anything else. Once you've planted trees, you can only get a felling licence to remove those if you replant on that land. So this is a problem for farmers. It's permanently changing farmland into woodland, and it's reducing the option for future generations of that farming family to move back into farming. Looking at woodland management as well, some woodland owners didn't even know that they needed to manage their woodland. It's just something that's there. They don't really think about it. It looks nice, but they've never bothered managing it before. Or there's a group of people who feel that you shouldn't manage woodlands because it's better just to leave nature to do its own thing there, and that's the best for the trees. But in fact, you do get better quality wood and more carbon storage if you do manage your woodland properly with thinning and removing, reducing the density. the RHI, the renewable heat incentive, that's been driving up woodland prices. The wood prices, because there's subsidies for boilers, it means it's created a market for wood chips and wood, wood pellets in this country. And so now it's economically viable for a lot of farmers to manage their woodlands and estate owners, and they can make a profit out of what was in the past just a cost if you managed your woodland. Also found that lots of farmers are really interested in agroforestry, so that's planting trees on arable land or on land, so as well as hedgerows and shelter belts, things like that. But at the moment, the government doesn't regulate agroforestry, so it then doesn't become eligible for any subsidies or payments, and that agroforestry is something else that the Committee on Climate Change is advocating, but we definitely need some action there to get more planting. So looking at all the problems to energy crop cultivation and woodland creation, I hope you've noticed that there's lots in common between the two sectors. The problems about losing income and long-term commitments. So using the framework from Rogers' theory of diffusion of innovation, I've just done this graph to show to show the characteristics down the left-hand side that are used in decision making when you're adopting some new activity, and the 5 different crops I've been looking at, and the standard decision making factors are the relative advantage of growing a crop, how compatible it is with your existing operation and within your existing attitudes, how complex it is, whether you can trial it for a short term as a pilot, whether you can observe it with some of your neighbours. So that's what a key factor with farmers and estate owners. They like to talk to other farmers and see what other farmers are up to, and if someone else has planted a crop, then it's far more likely that their friends, neighbours and relatives will find out about it from them and then follow suit. The risk has often been used in analysis as well, so I've done a quick risk assessment, mainly financial risk to the farm. Summary at the bottom of general perception and just what farmers think overall. So maize is just a new crop. Grass is also traditional. Miscanthus isn't traditional, but it's just a big grass really. Whereas willow needs a new mindset from a farmer. It's more like a tree than an arable crop, and they worry that it might damage their fields. And finally, woodland, that's a completely new sector. Farmers worry it reduces the value of their land. It's just not something they're familiar with at all. And one key factor is the term, which influences the risk. So we discussed that again, the different terms ranging from 1 year to permanent on the different crops. I think this explains a lot of the decision making. So having seen the barriers and what's stopping people planting, I then turned to look at the policies that would be needed, and this is covered for the whole of England now rather than just locally. And I used a Policy Delphi, and now Policy Delphi is a group consultation exercise which is used to gather opinions from experts and whose identities remain concealed from the rest of the group. And this is so that people don't dominate arguments or have any kind of rivalry. And a Policy Delphi is just a specific one that's run for policy analysis. So first I identified 43 policies that had been proposed for helping to deliver more energy crops or tree planting or agroforestry. And some of those came from the farmer interviews that I talked about already. A lot of lobbying groups have produced documents with suggestions in them. So the Woodland Trust or Crops for Energy, people like that, and also some academic literature as well. I categorised these into a framework of policy types, so financial, regulations, information or organisation policies where the government would deliver them themselves. And these policies were assessed by the group members who rated them on a 4-point scale to assess their desirability, feasibility, and their potential effectiveness. Then all their ratings and their comments to justify their ratings were collected from the first round and written up in a report, and then that was sent back out to the same experts. And I then spoke to them individually again to gather their reactions. So what we ended up with was a list of policies, each with justifications of the ratings, warnings about potential counterproductive impacts and side effects. And overall, for energy crops and forestry, everyone felt that we needed a single land use policy which can support delivery of different types of land use change, which are all public goods. And that is what has to be delivered by the new environmental land management scheme, which I'll speak about in a moment. Looking at the individual crops, for energy crops, it was unanimously viewed that incentives, rewards were needed, or investment with the power generators, so that they could then offer attractive contracts to farmers. And it was definitely needed to have the investment up at this top end of the supply chain. Action would never come from the farmers without those contracts in place. So it's definitely top of the supply chain. It's where we need the policy intervention. There might be some role for short-term planting grants just to build some confidence with the farmers. Recognition that perennial energy crops have a positive impact on wildlife and flood control might mean that they could be included in environmental schemes as well. And we still need education for farmers to make sure more of them know about the crops and the improvements that have been made in recent years, but also more awareness from the general public, because they have an important role on putting pressure on politicians. But if the public are lukewarm about something, nobody's going to push for that action. So we need a more supportive view from the public so that they understand really what's available there. Forestry and agroforestry, it's down to grants there, partly simpler grants with annual payments to replace that loss of income. More education to remove the divide between farming and forestry, possibly starting that in universities, so that we get farmers to think of forestry as a core business rather than just thinking that it's something that makes the farm look nicer on a small scale. They need to think about it on a bigger scale. Looking at the permanence of all new planting, which I mentioned before, it might be a good idea to allow some temporary planting schemes, so a 30 or 50-year energy forestry scheme, and after that it might allow the farm to revert to agricultural land. But you might hope after that period of time farmers would be happy with their woodland, but it overcomes this initial barrier of that permanence, which is stopping the initial planting. And finally, agroforestry needs some regulation and some incentives put in place, so including that in agro-environmental schemes. So I mentioned the environmental land management scheme and the common agricultural policy before. So when the UK was in the EU, farmers received money from the common agricultural policy. They got a direct payment just for having land at their disposal. And they also had to keep 5% of that for ecological focus areas, so fallow land or cover crops. They also got some additional payments to reward diversity of planting, and these were the ones that disadvantaged energy crops, but they've been removed anyway now. And then the final area is they get payments for taking part in agro-environmental schemes, which used to be known as stewardship. And that is payments for the farmers delivering environmental benefits, so flood mitigation, hedgerow expansion, or growing nectar-rich plants for pollinating insects. Those all offer payments to farmers. So under the Common Agricultural Policy, most farmers receive 40 to 60% of their farm income from these subsidies, which were very complicated and needed advisors and accountants to help the farmers. So the small farmers weren't always in a position to claim what they were, what they were entitled to, and it discouraged agroforestry and perennial energy crops, as I mentioned, but it did encourage farming, which wasn't really viable. So a lot of upland sheep farming on very poor land, which might be better off planted with trees. So after Brexit, the government's going to be introducing the Environmental Land Management Scheme, which is often known as ELM or ELMS. And that is going to reward farmers for public goods. Definition of a public good is a service or product which can be used by anybody, and its use doesn't reduce the amount available to others. So a flood barrier or street lighting, carbon storage. There's no incentive for individuals to deliver these public goods, so governments have to either supply them themselves or to intervene to encourage their production. So ELM will be phased in between this year and 2027, and they won't. By the end of that period, there won't be any single payments just for having land at their disposal, and they will have to enter into schemes at various levels, including sort of individual farm or local or landscape level. And woodland creation is going to be included in this. Also, policies for water, plants, and wildlife. And of course, adaptation to climate change and climate change mitigation should be included as well. It doesn't supply any support for food production, and that is concerned to the National Farmers Union, who represent farmers. There will be a separate agricultural policy which might offer some grants for investment. And there's a risk with this approach that a lot of food will be supplied from overseas, where the greenhouse emissions are even worse than here. So we're just exporting our emissions. So we think some farmers might intensify their farming methods to make up for the drop of income, and others will enter the environmental schemes, and some will have to stop farming altogether where they can no longer make a living. So this could dramatically change land prices in the UK, but that would make woodland creation more attractive. So in summary, what are the prospects for biomass production? I think poultry litter, there'll be only a significant uptake if litter spreading and storage regulations change dramatically, but there will be some increase in line with the AD expansion, and I know that we expect some more expansion for the new biomethane for transport subsidies. The prospects for energy crops could be really good. There are no real barriers to stop it happening. There are some negative attitudes, but at the right price, planting could increase. But we do need significant government intervention to get those 700,000 hectares planted. The prospects for wood fuel from woodland planting and management, although woodland planting has never been more popular and some good grants are available, more action is needed. The ELM should help with that, but the grants need to be even better. And then there's still this problem about permanence. People may prefer energy crops as a diversification rather than tree planting, just because of that permanence. And also, because trees are so popular at the moment, I do wonder whether there might be more pressure in the future to not extract any wood from newly created woodlands if it's going to be used for bioenergy. So that's just sort of a political issue. Right, in conclusion, BECCS also depends on carbon capture and storage operating at scale, which hasn't really been proved at that scale yet, although we have finally got some investment coming in that. We're very dependent on public policy. We need some way of rewarding negative emissions for both BECCS and tree planting. It's all about land use. We're never going to get these changes if we can't persuade farmers to come along with these changes, because they're the ones who are going to be making the final decisions. So the policies available need to be carefully balanced so that we get the right or the desired delivery of land use, so the right land use in the right place. And as I said, we need to balance it. It might be more popular to plant trees, but then farmers might view it as less risky to have an energy crop which they can remove. There's going to be a new UK biomass strategy produced next year, and a lot of the future will depend on what's actually included in that strategy. And I don't know, some of you might be contributing to that already. So that's it from me. So if you've got any questions, I'd be very happy to answer those for you.
Thank you so much, Judith. It's a wonderful talk on various, potential energy crops for the future bioenergy economy, and also you stressed on, various the barriers. That is something, the young researchers can look into those, the barriers that can happen this, So now, yes, the session, the talk is open for questions. Please do ask the questions. To Judith. You can raise your hands and directly ask, or you can chat, so I can ask on behalf of you. Right, so there is a question from Daniel from University of Leeds. He says, why were the Drax contracts cancelled? The technology and investor problems too.
I think in the end, they just find it easier to have big contracts with their supply chains from the US rather than manage individual small contracts, because the production locally was a much smaller scale, and also the incentives weren't significant enough to make it worth their while using that locally produced biomass. So that's a good question. So we need to make sure that when the new policies are in place, that they do encourage home production of biomass, and that we're not just encouraging even more to come in from overseas.
Right. So there, Daniel also says, like, with the policies you identified, were there any you found that none of the people you talked to mention? If there were, why do you think they did not know?
Sorry, I missed. I'll see if I can.
Yeah, so in the chat box.
Yeah,
the second comment from the Daniel. With the policies you identified.
Yeah.
Were there any you found that none of the people you talked to mention? If there were, why do you think they did not know?
I think most of the policies I listed were ones that people recognised. I mean, some of the ones that were particularly controversial were around permanence of planting. So the suggestion that you remove the need for replanting on a felling licence, that was something that some people didn't recognise, and that was one of the most controversial suggestions when that was suggested. So I think there were people from both sectors and mixed sectors when I did the policy Delphi. So some people were just more interested in energy crops, and some people were interested in woodlands, and most of them were interested in both sectors, but some of them just didn't know as much about the other sectors. I'm not sure if that's what you wanted, Daniel. Let me know if not.
Yeah, he also asked, like, what form of education would you feel would be most beneficial to change the farmer's attitude?
I think it was felt that starting that at a young age, so at the agricultural college or university, just so that they didn't think of forestry as something completely separate, and that the youngest farmers knew enough about woodland just to consider it when they were making plans for their farm, rather than just it not to cross. It just isn't something that a lot of older farmers think about, really. And so I think Kip's definitely young. I think one of the panel suggested including it in GCSE geography, but that might be a little young, possibly, to start trying to persuade people to plant trees on their farms. But certainly at agricultural college, there is a lot of information in the farming press. So places like Farmers Weekly. There are often articles in there, and at big agricultural shows like the northern one in Harrogate every year. All the forestry companies go to those and try and speak to the farmers there about planting on their land. So they're all beneficial. Just familiarity really, which is important, but plus starting young.
That's right. Yeah. Naveed asked. He says, yeah, economy is most important for farmers, and marginal land is one option. However, farmers need support and incentives to grow bioenergy crops and replace their traditional crops on farm. What you think about the transportation cost? Are you looking at centralized utilization? If so, are there energy costs in transportation?
Right. I haven't looked at the economics of this. That's something that's been missing from my research. But obviously, transportation cost is an issue. And I know, speaking to Terravesta and on the farm visit I went to, they have sort of incentives to help the farmers so that it's not a disincentive. But obviously location is important, and going back to that farm visit again, where we were standing in that field and the picture I showed earlier, you could actually see Brigg Power Station a few miles away. So location is very important, and I haven't looked at this yet, but my feeling is that we'd be looking at more of these smaller power stations, the size of Brigg, which is about 40 megawatts, rather than places like Drax. I'm not sure we'd ever want something that size again, but this is just speculation. I haven't done a lot of digging on this area at all, I'm afraid. I don't know if you've got any views on that.
Right. Yeah. So there is another question from the UKRI BBSRC. According to your research and the intensive research you have done, do you believe that the UK can be self-sufficient from bioenergy perspective?
It all depends how much bioenergy you want to use. I think I looked at the levels of miscanthus planting, and even 700,000 hectares wouldn't supply all of Drax's demand because it's just so big. It's just how much of your land you can spare for bioenergy when you've got all the competing demands from food and woodland and peat restoration. So I don't think we should import any more than we have at the moment, but I haven't done enough thinking. Basically, it just depends how big the bioenergy sector is going to be. Should we restrict it to what we can produce at home, or whether we are happy to import? And if we do import, what is our fair share of the worldwide biomass to be used here?
Yeah, and there's also like talks going on, like whether the crop based the bioenergy, if it's all the sustainable.
Yeah.
So what is your take on that?
I think that if you add in carbon capture and storage, then it looks very positive. I think that if you're looking at sustainability and carbon debts, then woodland is quite hard to justify to the skeptics. It requires quite a lot of effort to understand the models there. But that's the advantage of the perennial energy crops, that because the carbon debt is so only for a year or maybe 3 years, then it's much easier to sell that to the public and to the politicians and to answer the lobbying groups.
Yeah, that's right. And Sarah from Imperial asks, have you also looked at generating energy from farm waste, particularly as opposed to the bioenergy crops, and from a circular economy perspective, it would make more sense to exploit this heavily underutilized feedstock?
Yes, it depends which particular waste you're looking at there, or whether you class straw as a byproduct or a waste. But yes, certainly poultry litter, I think, is definitely underused. But then you have to decide whether you think it's an equally valuable use to use it as a fertilizer, because it's better than using the ash in some ways, because you get that soil improvement as well as just the nutrients. I think there is more scope for pig and cow manure, but it may be that we decrease the number of cows in the future anyway. So yeah, I didn't think there was a massive scope for those other than for as I said, for poultry litter, and there are competing demands, so you need to weigh up whether you think it's better from the the environment's point of view to recycle those nutrients.
Yeah, that's interesting point. So yeah, one last question from Lone Roberts. She says, with agriculture being developed in UK, did you investigate the post-Brexit policy in Wales and Scotland, along with England, in relation to your research?
No, I didn't, and there's Northern Ireland as well. I was careful to remember that it is only England in a lot of these policies, although most of the issues are common throughout the UK, except possibly that Scotland has a very different environment for forestry, sort of both traditionally being more having more commercial forestry going on there. But no, it does make it a whole new level of complication, that some things are devolved and some aren't. So I haven't had a chance to look at all the different areas. I think Wales is probably more like England than the others, but yeah, everything I've said in the last section only applies to England.
England, yeah, that's understandable. Yeah, I think I will wait a few more seconds. I think Loon again, he's looks like he's typing the second question. And the meanwhile, I would like to get the attention to all the audience here. We've been we plan a series of seminars as a part of this lecture series. Please do register and do show your interest if you would like to give a talk at one of these seminars. And yeah, you feel free to approach any of the share committee members. So that would be great if you take participate in this in the seminar series. And not just that, and we do have other events such as targeted research article writing skills, not only just writing skills, but our experts are going to highlight how to get published in good journals. So these are tips definitely going to benefit all of us. So please, save your time for those events. I think yes, I got the question from so see. Oh, so all right. So she agrees completely, and then she says thanks. Yeah. So I think there are no more questions I can see. Now, let me once again, Judith, thank you for your wonderful talk and your patience in answering all these questions from audience. On behalf of share members, the committee members, and as well as Supergen Bioenergy Supergen Bioenergy Hub. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you.